Imagine a narrow, dimly lit corridor of London's Wessex Studios at the end of a cold, bleak 1977, where the air is literally electrified by the hatred of two polar worlds ready to collide and annihilate each other. If you could stand in the center of that corridor with your eyes closed, your brain would be torn apart by cognitive dissonance. From behind the left door, divine, multi-layered harmonies worthy of an angelic choir would drift out. Harmonies that Freddie Mercury built with the obsession of a jeweler. From behind the right door, as if from an open sewer, a primal, filthy cacophony would surge, the sound of snapping strings and drunken wails with which the Sex Pistols were trying to destroy the very idea of music. Do you think it was a mere coincidence that Britain's two major bands ended up in the same building? No, it was the irony of fate, deciding to test the nervous system of rock and roll by locking Mozart and a rabid dog in the same cage. In those days, London was burning, and that is not a metaphor. The punk revolution was marching through the streets in ripped jeans with safety pins in their cheeks, proclaiming death to the old dinosaurs, like Queen, whom they considered fat, self-satisfied bourgeois who had forgotten the smell of the streets. Sid Vicious, the Pistols' new bassist, was the living embodiment of this chaos. He couldn't play. He could barely stand on his feet due to a cocktail of cheap alcohol and heroin, and his body was a map of scars from blades he used to cut himself right on stage for the show. He wasn't a musician. He was a walking grenade with the pin pulled, and on that specific evening, he was looking for a place to explode. But while Sid wandered the corridors, leaving a trail of destruction and the smell of vomit behind him, behind the heavy soundproof door of Studio A, an atmosphere reminiscent of an operating room or a temple of art reigned. Freddie Mercury sat at a massive black grand piano, his back straight as a taut string. He was dressed not in leather and spikes, but in an elegant silk kimono, and every movement radiated that very aristocracy that the punks hated to the point of grinding their teeth. You look at him and see a man completely immersed in creating a masterpiece, but your gaze must catch one tiny, seemingly insignificant detail lying on the lacquered lid of the instrument, right under the maestro's hand. This is the dagger that will flip the finale of this scene, but right now it looks harmless. It is a perfectly ironed, snow-white handkerchief made of the finest cotton, folded into a neat square. Why is it here? Do you think it's just a sign of Freddie's cleanliness? You're wrong. In Mercury's world, there are no accidental objects. This handkerchief is a symbol of his absolute control over reality, a barrier between his sterile world of high aesthetics and the filth of the outside world. Remember this piece of cloth, because in a few minutes, it will turn into the most humiliating weapon ever used in the history of rock conflicts, a weapon more terrifying than a fist or a knife. Ask yourself honestly, how would you feel knowing that behind the wall is a person who publicly calls your work piss and calls for your physical destruction? Most of us would lock the door, call security, hide. But Freddie didn't lock any doors. He played complex Chopin passages as a warm-up, ignoring the fact that in the next room, a group of anarchists was trying to record an album intended to bury his career. Was it arrogance? Or was it the confidence of a predator who knows that a lion should not worry about the opinion of hyenas? And then, the inevitable happened. The door to Studio A swung open, not from a polite knock, but from a kick. Sid Vicious appeared on the threshold. He looked like every mother's nightmare. Pale, with a crazed look, bare-chested and covered in scratches, staggering as he tried to focus his vision. He entered enemy territory, not to say hello or ask for sugar. He came for blood. In his clouded brain, Queen was the embodiment of everything wrong with music. They were too complex, too rich, too sweet. Sid felt like a messiah of destruction, and sitting before him was the ultimate Antichrist, the Queen in ballet tights. Do you feel the air thickening? At that moment, every sound engineer in the room stopped breathing. This was not just a meeting of two musicians. It was a collision of two philosophies, two eras, two universes that could not coexist in one space without an explosion. Sid, staggering, moved toward the piano. He felt dominant. He was younger. He was angrier. He was more dangerous. He thought Freddie would jump up, get scared, and start calling for help. After all, what could this pampered dandy do against a street fighter with nothing to lose? This is where the Santa Barbara effect kicks in, breaking your expectations. Freddie didn't even turn around at the sound of the door opening. He continued to play, his fingers running across the keys with the same ease with which water flows over stones. This ignoring was the first slap in the face. Sid expected a reaction. He craved conflict, but he hit a wall of absolute indifference. This infuriated him even more. He stepped right up to the piano, looming over the seated Freddie, his shadow falling across the keys, disrupting the perfect geometry of the moment. The smell of stale booze and an unwashed body hit Mercury's nose, mixing with the scent of his expensive perfume, creating a nauseating contrast. Sid smirked, baring rotten teeth, and prepared to deliver his verbal blow, which he believed would crush Freddie against the wall. He was certain of his victory. He was certain that this ballet dancer would cry and run away. But Sid failed to consider one thing. He hadn't entered the cage of a victim. He had entered the cage of a being whose intellect was sharper than any razor Sid carried in his pocket. Freddie still wasn't looking at him, but his hand froze over the keys for a split second, and in that pause, there was such a threatening silence that even a drunk Sid should have felt a chill running down his spine. But he was too stupid and too drunk to realize. He had just made the biggest mistake of his short life by deciding that rudeness could defeat style. He opened his mouth to utter a phrase that would go down in history, unaware that Freddie's response would turn him into a laughingstock faster than he could blink. To understand the full surreality and danger of the moment when Sid Vicious loomed over Freddie Mercury's piano, we need to stop time for a second and look into the cultural rift that divided these two men deeper than the Berlin Wall. You probably think this is just the drunken stunt of an arrogant youth, but that is a superficial view. In reality, in that stifling room of Wessex Studios, a battle for the soul of British music was taking place. On one side was Sid, the avatar of chaos, a man who turned an inability to play into an ideology, the living embodiment of the "No Future" slogan, convinced that destruction was the only form of creativity available to an honest man. He looked at Freddie's back and saw everything he despised: education, talent, wealth, and most importantly, a striving for beauty that punks considered a bourgeois relic worthy only of destruction. For Vicious, fueled by cheap alcohol and his own perceived impunity, Freddie was a dinosaur who needed to be not just insulted, but trampled, to prove the superiority of the new era. Sid took another step, and his shadow covered the keyboard, causing Freddie to miss a beat for a fraction of a second. A microscopic victory that, however, caused a surge of sadistic delight in the punk. Do you smell that? It's not just a metaphor. Sid reeked of a mixture of old sweat, sour beer, tobacco smoke, and that specific sour note that comes from people who haven't washed their clothes in a long time. This stench invaded Mercury's sterile, perfumed space like a biological weapon. Anyone else in Freddie's place would have jumped up, held their nose, or called security. But Mercury remained seated, and in that stillness, there was not submission, but the terrifying confidence of a sphinx that cannot be disturbed by the barking of a stray dog. And here the conveyor principle begins to work, making you ask questions. Why didn't Sid hit him? Why didn't he flip the piano? The answer is simple and complex at the same time. Physical violence would have been too easy, too banal. Sid wanted more. He wanted to humiliate Freddie intellectually. He wanted to hit him with a word so hard that this peacock would feel like a nonentity. In Vicious's inflamed brain, a phrase ripened that he thought would be a knockout blow, exposing the very essence of Queen's work as something artificial and mincing. He drew in a breath of air saturated with studio dust, curled his lips into his signature, contemptuous smirk, baring bad teeth, and leaning toward Freddie's very ear, rasped words that were meant to go down in history as a sentence. "So, Fred," he began, deliberately shortening the name to a familiar, working-class version to erase distance and greatness, "have you succeeded in bringing ballet to the masses yet?" Listen to that phrase. It wasn't just a question. It was a poisoned dart, aimed at the most vulnerable point, as Sid saw it, of Mercury's image. The mention of ballet in 1977, in the midst of punk's testosterone-fueled rebellion, was equivalent to an accusation of weakness, of femininity, of being out of touch with reality. Sid was hitting at Freddie's stage costumes, his tights, his grace, trying to frame it as something shameful, as a clown show for wealthy old ladies. He expected Freddie to flare up, start making excuses, turn red with anger or shame. Sid was already imagining how he would tell people in the pub later that he took down that old queen with a single phrase. At that moment, that ringing silence fell upon the studio, the kind where you can almost hear the electricity running through the wires. The sound engineers behind the glass froze, afraid to move. Everyone understood. An explosion was about to happen. This was the point of no return. Two worlds had collided head-on. Ask yourself honestly, what would you do if a filthy, aggressive junkie burst into your workplace and spat on your life's work, calling it trash? The fight-or-flight instinct would kick in instantly. You would either punch him in the jaw or retreat. But Freddie Mercury was no ordinary man, and his reaction is what breaks the mold, that Santa Barbara effect that makes you rethink the concept of power. Freddie stopped playing. His hands slowly, with the grace of a pianist, lifted from the keys. The final chord hung in the air and dissolved. He didn't jump up. He didn't scream. He didn't even turn his head immediately. He held the pause, a theatrical, dramatic pause that lasted exactly long enough to turn Sid's confidence into confusion. Vicious, expecting an instant reaction, began to get nervous. Why is he silent? Why isn't he afraid? This silence was louder than any scream. It said that Freddie did not perceive Sid as a threat. He perceived him as an annoying nuisance, like a fly buzzing in his ear during a symphony. Slowly, very slowly, Freddie began to turn on his swivel stool. The creak of the mechanism in the silence sounded like the cocking of a trigger. He turned to face Sid, but he didn't stand up. He remained seated, and seemingly this put him at a disadvantage. Sid was looming over him, dominating physically. But look at their faces. Sid is twitchy, sweaty, with darting eyes looking for confirmation of his toughness. And Freddie is calm, his back straight, his face showing not a single twitching muscle. His eyes, dark and deep, looked up at the punk from below, but in that gaze was so much royal dignity that it seemed as if he were looking from a palace balcony at a drunken peasant who had fallen into the mud. Do you think Freddie was offended? You're wrong. In his eyes one read, not offense, but boredom. A deadly, aristocratic boredom. He saw before him not a revolutionary, but a child who had drawn an obscene word on a fence and was waiting for the adults to scold him. And it was this realization, that before him was not an enemy, but simply a stupid boy, that gave Freddie the weapon against which the punk had no defense. Intellect. Sid came to a gunfight with a knife, but Freddie already had his finger on the nuclear button of sarcasm. The smell of an inevitable denouement hung in the air. Sid shifted from foot to foot, feeling the initiative slipping from his hands like sand. He wanted chaos, but he received an icy shower of contempt. He waited for an answer, but even in his worst nightmares, he couldn't imagine that Freddie would answer him not as a rock star to a rock star, but as a governess to a misbehaving ward. And while Freddie drew air to utter his legendary line, no one in the room noticed that snow-white handkerchief lying on the piano, already waiting for its moment to put a final, humiliating point on this duel, turning Sid's rebellion into a farce. But before that handkerchief touched the skin, a word had to be spoken that would wound deeper than a knife. The music cuts off instantly, as if someone had severed the invisible umbilical cord connecting this world to harmony, and an absolute visual silence falls over Wessex Studios, pressing against the ears harder than the roar of a jet engine. This was not just a break in the playing, it was a black hole sucking in all sounds, all movements, all hopes for a peaceful outcome. The sound engineers, behind the thick armored glass of the control room, turned into pillars of salt, their hands frozen over the faders, their eyes widened in horror because they understood. Right now, in this very second, in this hermetic box, matter and antimatter were colliding. Sid Vicious, breathing heavily, with saliva dripping from his chin, stood over the seated Freddie, his shadow falling across Mercury's face like a shroud. The punk smirked, baring his rotten teeth, certain that his phrase about ballet was the killing shot after which the old queen would either burst into tears or shriek. But the seconds passed. 1, 2, 3, and there was no scream. And here the cruelest loop of tension begins to work. Why isn't the victim behaving like a victim? Sid, whose brain was clouded by drugs, began to feel the ground slipping from beneath his feet. He expected fear. He fed on fear. But instead of the smell of adrenaline, he felt something completely different, something that confused him. The smell of absolute icy calm. Freddie Mercury slowly, with a grace a king cobra would envy, began to turn on his velvet swivel stool. The creak of the mechanism in this tomb-like silence sounded like the cocking of a trigger on a dueling pistol. You look at this and think, now he's going to stand up and hit him. That is what the logic of a street fight demands. But Freddie breaks the fourth wall of reality, applying the Santa Barbara effect. He doesn't stand up. He remains seated, and this is the most powerful move he could make. By staying down, he paradoxically ended up higher. He looked up at Sid, but in his gaze was so much condescending majesty, so much disgusted pity, as if he were examining not a dangerous anarchist, but a misbehaving puppy that had soiled the Persian rug. At that moment, Freddie turned into a sphinx, and Sid into a tourist, trying to scratch his name on a pyramid. Mercury's gaze slid over the scars on Vicious's chest, over his dirty jeans, over the safety pin stuck into his skin, and stopped on his eyes. This was not a duel of gazes. It was a vivisection. Freddie was taking him apart without a scalpel. He saw before him not a punk icon, but a deeply unhappy lost child who had put on a monster mask so as not to be hurt. And Freddie decided to rip off that mask with one flick of his tongue. He drew air into his lungs, but not to scream. His lips, hidden under his famous mustache, stretched into a smile. Not kind, not evil, but that very Cheshire cat smile that promises the disappearance of all existence. "Ah, Mr. Ferocious," he uttered. Listen to those sounds. He didn't say Mr. Vicious. He said Mr. Ferocious. It seems like a play on words, but in reality, it was a linguistic execution. The word vicious carries a threat, malice, danger. It is the name Sid chose for himself to scare the commoners. No, the word ferocious, uttered with that lingering, affected, purely British intonation, instantly transformed Sid from a dangerous predator into a cartoon character. You don't call a killer that. You call a hamster that tries to bite a finger that. You call a little child who has put on his father's boots and is growling at the mirror that. With one word substitution, Freddie castrated the entire stage image of the Sex Pistols. He showed that he saw not a threat, but a diligent, sweaty attempt to seem like a threat. Sid blinked. His clouded brain tried to process the information. He expected profanity. He expected get out. Instead, he got a nickname that sounded like a compliment, but burned like acid. He opened his mouth to say something back, but the words got stuck in his throat because Freddie wasn't finished yet. Mercury held the pause, just long enough to savor the enemy's confusion, and continued in his velvety baritone, in which steel rang, "We're doing our best, dear." The word dear became the finishing shot to the head of the punk revolution. You don't call your enemy dear. You call a servant, a negligent waiter, or a stupid child that. With this word, Freddie didn't just put Sid in his place. He annulled his existence as an equal rival. He denied him the right to war. He turned a generational conflict into a scene where a strict governess scolds a hooligan for dirty hands. A silence of a completely different quality fell over the studio. If before it was the silence of fear, now it was the silence of shock. Sid Vicious, the man who spat in the face of the Queen, the one in Buckingham Palace, stood spat upon by the Queen, the one sitting at the piano, and didn't even understand how it happened. He was armed with nihilism, rudeness, and rage, but Freddie came out against him with a weapon against which the punk had no armor: irony and etiquette. Sid shifted from foot to foot, his fists clenched and unclenched. He looked bewildered. His entire script had collapsed. He came to destroy the ballet, and ended up in the role of a clumsy bear at a debutante ball. He felt stupid, and that feeling, the feeling of his own absurdity in the face of true greatness, was more terrifying to him than any physical blow. Freddie didn't even stand up from his stool, but in this psychological duel, he already loomed over Sid like a skyscraper over a shack. But the most terrifying thing for Sid wasn't the words. The most terrifying thing was in Freddie's eyes. There was no fear in them. There was boredom. Freddie, with his entire appearance, was showing, "You tire me. You are boring. Your rebellion is a cliché." And for a man who built his life on shock value, becoming boring is death. Sid wanted to be Lucifer, but Freddie saw in him only a minor imp who had walked through the wrong door. At that moment, while the echo of the word dear still hung under the ceiling of Wessex Studios, the history of rock took a turn. Brutal force, which seemingly should have defeated refinement, shattered against the cliffs of intellect. Sid stood there, breathing heavily, and in his eyes, a realization began to dawn that he had lost. But Freddie wasn't finished. The words had been spoken, the psychology had worked, but now a physical point had to be made. The trash had to be taken out, and for this, Freddie prepared that very gesture that would turn this scene from a dialogue into a legend, a gesture involving that very snow-white handkerchief you hopefully haven't forgotten. But before he touched the cloth, Sid had to make one more mistake. He had to stay standing, hoping to regain face, not realizing his face was already lost forever. The words, "We're doing our best, dear," hung in the stale air of Wessex Studios like a cloud of toxic gas, and the second the echo of Freddie's velvety baritone dissolved into silence, something happened that forever changed the balance of power in that room. You look at Sid Vicious, at this self-proclaimed king of anarchy, and you expect an explosion? After all, by all laws of the genre, by all rules of a street fight, such humiliation should be followed by a brass knuckle blow, a spit, or at least a frantic scream of curses. Your brain, raised on action movies, screams, "The slaughter is about to start." But reality makes that Santa Barbara turn that leaves you frozen with your mouth open. Sid does not move. He is paralyzed. The verbal slap he just received was so elegant, so unexpected and crushing that it short-circuited his neural connections. He came to fight a rich snob, and he was scolded like a misbehaving schoolboy. And in this second of confusion, Freddie Mercury saw his opportunity to put a physical point that would turn this dialogue into a legend. Freddie slowly rose from his swivel stool. It wasn't the sudden movement of a fighter preparing to spar. It was the smooth, fluid movement of mercury rising in a thermometer when the temperature reaches a critical point. You might forget, looking at his ballet tights and affected gestures, that Freddie was a physically strong man, full of that healthy, vital energy that the drug-exhausted Sid so lacked. When Mercury straightened to his full height, he turned out to be not just taller than Vicious, He seemed a monolith next to a straw scarecrow. He stepped toward the punk, closing the distance to an intimate, dangerous point, to the line where breath mixes, and Sid instinctively recoiled, expecting a blow. But no blow followed. Instead of a fist, Freddie reached out and, with an expression of squeamish, almost medical caution, gripped Sid by the lapels of his famous leather jacket. Look at this gesture more closely. Play it back in your head in slow motion. He didn't grab him like you grab an enemy in a fight to throw him over your hip. No, he took him the way a squeamish housewife takes a dirty rag with 2 fingers to carry it to the trash bin. There was no aggression in this grip. There was total, annihilating dominance. Sid, this terror of London, suddenly turned into a rag doll in Freddie's hands, a limp mannequin from which the air had been let out. Why didn't he resist? Why didn't he knee Freddie? Because in this second, he was psychologically broken. He was hypnotized by this calm power, this confidence of a man who knows that truth and strength are on his side. Freddie turned him toward the door. He didn't push him in the back. He simply led him like you lead a drunk guest who has ruined a party. "I think it's time for you to go, Simon," Freddie uttered, deliberately using Vicious's real name, Simon Ritchie, thereby finally stripping him of his stage villain mask. This walk to the door took only 5 seconds, but for Sid, it was an eternity of disgrace. He stumbled along trying to keep his balance, his spikes and chains clinking piteously, but he couldn't break free from the steel grip because his will was paralyzed. Freddie brought him to the threshold, opened the door with one hand while continuing to hold Mr. Ferocious with the other, and with a light, almost careless movement, put him out into the corridor. Do you expect Freddie to say something pompous as a farewell? Something like, "And don't come back"? No. He just let go of the jacket, as if dropping ballast, and closed the door in the punk's face. The click of the lock sounded like the shot of a guillotine, severing the head of the revolution. Sid remained there, in the cold corridor, humiliated, bewildered, alone with his smell and his defeat, while Freddie remained inside, in the warmth and light of the studio. No, the most important thing, the most powerful chord of this symphony of humiliation, was still to come. Freddie turned and walked back to the piano. His gait was calm, his breathing steady. He approached the instrument, sat on the stool, but didn't touch the keys immediately. And here, the dagger we talked about at the very beginning comes onto the stage, the detail that turns a simple story into an intellectual orgasm. Freddie's gaze fell on the lid of the piano, where the perfectly folded snow-white handkerchief, made of the finest cotton, lay. Do you remember it? You thought it was there to wipe sweat from his brow while playing? Oh, how wrong you were. Freddie slowly, with the same grace with which he hit the highest notes, reached out and took that handkerchief. Absolute silence reigned in the studio. The sound engineers watched his every move, not understanding what was happening. Freddie unfolded the cloth. It crunched in the silence. And then he did the thing that destroyed Sid. Vicious finally, even through the closed door, he began to wipe his hands. He thoroughly, methodically wiped his palms, his fingers, every inch of skin that had come into contact with Sid's jacket. He wiped them as if he had touched something contagious, something toxic, something unspeakably filthy. Do you understand the meaning of this gesture? It was not just an act of hygiene. It was a ritual of purification. With this movement, he said more than any punk rock critic. He showed that for him, Sid Vicious was not an enemy, not a competitor, not an ideological opponent. For him, Sid was simply filth, dust, a bacterium that had accidentally flown into a sterile laboratory of art and needed to be washed away to continue the work. If he had hit Sid, it would have meant he recognized him as an equal, recognized him as a threat. A fight is an interaction between two men, but wiping one's hands is an interaction between a man and garbage. It was an act of supreme arrogance, but a deserved arrogance. Freddie turned physical contact into a demonstration of disgust. He erased Sid from his hands, like one erases chalk from a board. Finishing this ritual, he disdainfully tossed the crumpled handkerchief into the wastebasket, sitting under the piano. The handkerchief fell with a soft rustle. That was the point, the finale. Freddie straightened the cuffs of his silk kimono, straightened his back, closed his eyes for a second, switching from trash removal mode to world creation mode, and his fingers once again descended onto the keys. The sound that filled the studio in the next second was pure, crystal, divine. It was the introduction to one of Queen's ballads, complex, harmonious, perfect. The contrast was staggering. Just a moment ago, it smelled of sweat and aggression. Now, the music of the spheres reigned. Freddie played, and there wasn't a shadow of anger on his face, nor a trace of the conflict he had just endured. He had already forgotten Sid. For him, the incident was closed the moment the handkerchief touched the bottom of the basket. In this scene, in this calm return to music after a physical confrontation, lies the answer to the question of who won the war between punk and rock. Sid Vicious thought strength was loudness, violence, and chaos. Freddie Mercury proved that true strength is creation, discipline, and a sense of self-dignity that cannot be soiled, even if you are spat upon. He showed that bringing ballet to the masses is not a weakness. It is the ability to preserve beauty in a world obsessed with ugliness. And when the music filled the space again, it became clear, punk can scream, punk can break things, but punk can never create anything like this. Freddie didn't just kick Sid out of the room, he kicked him out of history, leaving him behind the door in the cold corridor of oblivion, while he himself continued to write eternity on the black and white keys. The music born under Freddie Mercury's fingers fills the studio space, displacing the final molecules of the chaos Sid Vicious brought with him. But do not hurry to exhale and think the story ended the moment the door slammed shut. In fact, that click of the lock was the starting pistol for two fates that flew off in opposite directions at such speed that it's impossible to track them without a sense of vertigo. The screen of our imagination must now split in two, showing you not just the future of two musicians, but the finale of two ideologies that collided on that winter day in 1977. On the left, the cold, dirty corridor where the humiliated king of punk staggers. On the right, the warm, light-filled studio where the true king continues to create eternity. Do you think Sid left to lick his wounds and write a song of revenge? Oh, if only it were that simple. Reality, as always, turned out to be far more cruel and instructive than any moralizing novel. Just a little over a year later, in February 1979, that same Sid Vicious, who so pompously asked Freddie about ballet, would be found dead in a New York apartment. The cause? A heroin overdose, which, according to one of the most terrifying versions, was given to him by his own mother. He was only 21 years old. Think about that number. He died without ever really learning to play the bass guitar, without ever writing a single great melody, without ever understanding that rebellion for the sake of rebellion is a road to nowhere. His slogan, "No Future," turned out to be not a political manifesto, but a terrifying self-fulfilling prophecy. That very snow-white handkerchief Freddie used to wipe his hands became a metaphor for Sid's entire life. He was filth on the hands of history that was simply washed down the drain of time, leaving behind only t-shirts with his face and a myth that self-destruction is cool. Now look at the right side of the screen. While Sid's body was cooling in a coroner's bag, Queen was releasing the album Jazz, then The Game. Then they stepped onto the Live Aid stage and stole the show from the whole world. Freddie Mercury proved that bringing ballet to the masses is not a weakness. It is a titanic labor requiring discipline, talent, and a will to live. He died 12 years after Sid, but he left not as a victim of circumstances, but as a winner who left behind a legacy that rings out in every stadium, at every wedding, in every karaoke bar on the planet. His ballet outlived Sid's anarchy, because creation always, in the end, defeats destruction. A building built by an architect stands for centuries, but a broken window smashed by a hooligan is replaced the next day, and the hooligan is forgotten. But here, that very intellectual orgasm arises, making us return to the handkerchief in the trash basket. Do you think Freddie despised Sid only for the filth? No. Freddie despised him for laziness. For Mercury, who honed every note, who worked like a demon to achieve perfection, Sid Vicious was the embodiment of mediocrity, trying to mask a lack of talent with shock value. Freddie understood before anyone, punk is not a revolution. It is the hysteria of the talentless. Wiping his hands with the handkerchief, he didn't just clean his skin. He drew a line between art and performance. He was telling us, look, the king is naked. There's nothing under this leather jacket and spikes. Emptiness. And history confirmed he was right. We remember Sid as a style icon, as a face on a poster, but we don't sing his songs. We sing Freddie's songs. However, let's apply the Santa Barbara effect and flip this chessboard to see the situation from the other side, because the world is not black and white. What if Freddie was wrong in his arrogance? What if Sid Vicious was a necessary evil? Imagine 70s music without punk. It was becoming fat, self-satisfied, out of touch with reality. Rock stars were turning into millionaires, flying on private jets, forgetting what hunger and anger felt like. Sid Vicious, for all his filth and lack of talent, was that very stone thrown into a stagnant swamp. He was needed to shake up the industry, to remind everyone that rock and roll is not only harmony, but also energy and rage and danger. Maybe the fact that Freddie had to face Sid made Queen get tougher? Remember the News of the World album they were recording in that very studio. The songs We Will Rock You and Sheer Heart Attack are a response to punk. They are simple, hard, aggressive tracks. Freddie accepted the challenge. He didn't sink to Sid's level, but he heard that noise behind the wall and transformed it into his music. Does it turn out that the trash influenced the gold, after all? Does it turn out that without this encounter, we might not have gotten the drive present in Late Queen? This thought erodes the finality of the conclusion. We want to see Freddie as a flawless hero who defeated the villain. But culture is a complex organism where viruses are sometimes just as important as vitamins. Sid Vicious burned out so others could understand how not to live, but his fire lit up the dark corners that aesthetes like Freddie were afraid to look into. And now, when you see the full picture, from the humiliating deer to the tragic death in New York and the eternal triumph at Wembley, I place the scales of history before you. On one side is Freddie Mercury, the aesthete, the creator, the snob who believed music should elevate. On the other side is Sid Vicious, the nihilist, the destroyer, the victim who believed music should destroy. Who is right in this eternal battle? Did Sid deserve such cold, annihilating humiliation for his audacity? Or did Freddie show an arrogance unworthy of a genius by refusing to see the pain behind the mask of aggression? Was punk a necessary cleansing fire? Or was it just filth that needed to be washed away with a snow-white handkerchief? I want you to stop being just spectators and become judges in this cultural process. Go down to the comments right now. Don't write Freddie is cool. That's obvious. I want to see your position in this conflict of philosophies. What is more important for the world? Flawless, but sometimes arrogant beauty, or filthy but honest rage? Write one word, creation or rebellion, and explain why you think so. Because this dispute in Wessex Studios in 1977 didn't end then. It continues every day inside each of us, when we choose between the desire to build something beautiful and the desire to tear everything to hell. I will be waiting for your verdict.